Welcome back to the Tony Styles Show. I'm Gary Franchi, sitting in for Tony Styles. All you listeners out there, Mohawk Nation, you are now part of the Franchi Mafia. That is the catchphrase of the day. So, Tony will be back next week. And remember, go to his website, TonyStyles.com. They got lots of great editorials. You can sign up for Tony's email newsletter at TonyStyles.com. And unlike other email newsletters, Tony's is not as annoying as others. It's actually worth reading. Now, by signing up, you become eligible for a free Tony Styles t-shirt. I have one. I wash my car with it all the time. Now, they're also for sale, the t-shirts, at TonyStyles.com. Everything you need to understand how we are screwed as Americans if we don't take action now is right here, right there, on the Tony Styles website, TonyStyles.com. Now, before the break, we were listening to an interview with award-winning entrepreneur and news anchor Ben Swan about the corporate manipulation by the media to control the public. And we're going to jump right back into that interview right now.
And so if you are someone who leans to the right, you'll go to Fox because you believe Fox is going to validate what you already believe. It's the same thing with internet media and blogs. You go to Daily Caller or Breitbart, or you go to Mother Jones, depending on which side of the political spectrum you fall on. And what you're expecting from those folks is that whatever stories they run are going to validate your worldview.
Now, Ben, terms that are thrown around a lot are national media or mainstream media. Could you help our viewers by defining what those terms actually mean?
Well, I think it's becoming a little more blurred because of the internet. But essentially, mainstream media, the idea is that really encompasses the three major networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC. Fox Network, News Network on cable still refers to that media as mainstream, even though Fox is just as mainstream as anybody. And not that there's anything wrong with being mainstream media. You know, it's almost become kind of a slur in our culture to talk about the mainstream media. And I think that politicians have used that term quite a bit. People like Sarah Palin use it kind of as a slur. There's nothing wrong with being mainstream, but I think what we're finding more and more is that mainstream, it really encompasses what people as the viewer or the reader or the listener begin to determine as a credible source of media. So there's lots of different media out there. There are a lot of blogs. There are lots of internet sites. But would the average American believe that those forms of media are trustworthy? And so mainstream has become the term I think that we use for trusted media, even though most Americans don't really trust that media anymore. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic that I think we're seeing play out.
I want to get into that trust issue in just a moment, but how is journalism changing as reporters become the news, as in the case of Glenn Greenwald being the sounding board for Edward Snowden? Now we see that Greenwald's partner was recently detained at an airport, and all of his materials and USB sticks and computers were seized and searched just by being an associate or a partner of that journalist.
Right. Well, I think that what we saw happen with Greenwald's partner is kind of becoming par for the course. I mean, if you can't necessarily go after that one journalist, which, by the way, they have gone after Glenn Greenwald in a number of ways. I believe it was on Piers Morgan tonight when Alan Dershowitz and Piers Morgan had a debate back and forth about whether or not Glenn Greenwald actually hates America. And so there was a lot of debate about kind of where he stood. Look, one of the things that we've done in media today is we've decided that you have to, as a journalist, be advocating for some side, either the right side or the left side. And so it's always about kind of punishing that journalist by looking at what are they trying to accomplish here. And so in Glenn Greenwald's case, by interviewing Edward Snowden, by being the voice of the information he was putting out, who is he really trying to help? Is he trying to help the Russians? Is he trying to help the Chinese? Alan Dershowitz actually says that in that interview, he says Glenn Greenwald loves totalitarian governments and he loves tyrannical regimes. Really? So the idea here is that Glenn Greenwald, because he can't just be a journalist, has to be out there attempting to prop somebody up. And in this case, Glenn Greenwald reveals the NSA prison program because he loves tyranny. That was the claim that was made. It plants seeds in people's minds. It's always that media is attempting to sway you in some way. Sometimes a journalist is just trying to be a journalist. They're just trying to reveal information that they believe the public has a right to. And I think that's what Greenwald was doing.
Let's talk about the war on drugs and how the media plays a role in it. For example, just recently, CNN Sanjay Gupta has been actively investigating the health benefits of marijuana. obviously a controversial topic, but we're seeing that media outlet move forward with it. And we've aired multiple interviews with advocates for marijuana and health, and aired documentaries on this station as well. So how do you feel that the media plays, what role it plays with the war on drugs?
Well, I think the media sits back and really, in a lot of cases, attempts to gauge the blood pressure, if you will, the feeling of the nation as a whole before they take a stand on anything. So the fact that Sanjay Gupta was able to come out and talk about the fact that essentially he has, reported wrong information over the years or failed to look at the facts of dealing with cannabis, when he talked about that on CNN, you have to believe that somebody higher up said, it's okay, you're allowed to say this. And that's not to say everything that they say is censored, but I think there's always been a very careful area there in terms of controlling what kind of message gets out. So when it comes to the war on drugs, most media will not talk about cannabis. They certainly don't talk about hemp, which is a fascinating subject in and of itself, because the United States is the #1 importer of hemp around the world, and yet it's illegal to grow it here. And state after state, by the way, right now is using nullification to nullify federal law and saying we're going to institute hemp farming in our states again because it's a great cash crop and it's an extremely useful crop. Kentucky's done that. Maine has done that. Vermont just did that. We had a story up at benswan.com about this. What's interesting is that most national media won't talk about the hemp issue at all. They kind of, and if they do, it's always to find some rally with about 12 people and someone who looks as strange as possible and interview that person. So there is definitely an influencer that goes along with media in how they portray this. When they talk about drugs, many times they do find the less mainstream person to interview, the person who looks a little more on the fringe, and that becomes the representation of those people. I think one thing media does a very powerful job of, whether it's good or bad, they do a powerful job of framing an argument based upon who they talk to and how they deal with people, and I think it can be troublesome.
Censorship, nothing new. It's in the media all the time. But we got to take a first-hand look at the corruption in the corporate world in a recent interview with three-time award-winning investigative journalist and former CNN reporter Amber Lyon. Now, when she was doing a location report in Bahrain, Lyon saw firsthand how the news, and therefore the message of the people of Bahrain, the attacks that were taking place there, was being skewed to benefit the state. She was actually asked by CNN to take state-sponsored news stories and inject them into her reporting, to report in favor of the state, rather what was actually happening. Let's go to that. Joining us now is Amber Lyon, a three-time Emmy Award-winning investigative journalist. She's a former CNN reporter who saw firsthand massive censorship while covering news in Bahrain. Lyon was laid off from CNN as part of an unrelated move by the network to outsource its investigative documentaries. In September, she went public with CNN's censorship, and now she's speaking with us. Amber, thanks for joining us. Could you briefly describe what you saw during the crackdown in Bahrain?
Yeah, well, with the assistance of troops from Saudi Arabia, the Bahraini security forces were committing horrific human rights abuses against these pro-democracy protesters. We found doctors who say they were tortured after the military took over the hospital. We interviewed patients who were literally still in their hospital gowns, hiding in their basements, self-treating birdshot wounds and picking the bullets out one by one because they were so scared to go back to the hospital. We also found journalists who were tortured by security forces as well. So it was a pretty intense crackdown that we felt the United States public needed to hear about because we're supporting this regime in Bahrain, the regime that's committing these abuses.
So go back again about what was the actual role played by the Saudi Arabian security forces during the crackdown?
Yeah, after around February 14th, 2011, the Bahraini protesters really took over the streets of Bahrain. This is one of the most pure revolutions in the area. More than 70% of the people want this current regime out. So hundreds of thousands of people were able to gather in Pearl Roundabout, the center of Manama, and protest. And that really terrified the current regime. And with the help of Saudi troops, they brought in tanks and equipment and soldiers from Saudi Arabia and came in and just had an intense crackdown on protesters. There's one video online, you can YouTube it. Bahraini protesters were shot and killed in broad daylight by some of these tanks. So it was an intense crackdown that literally had sent all of these protesters back into their homes and their villages hiding.
Now, is it fair to say that the official repression in Bahrain was comparable to what was happening in Libya at the time?
I'd say that it's hard to tell because we never really know 100% what news we're getting and if we're getting the full story from all of these areas. But I will tell you that it was an intense crackdown. We had pro-democracy protesters walking down a main street in broad daylight who were shot and killed. And as well as the military took over the hospital, and started arresting doctors for treating protesters who'd been wounded by the troops. So that alone violates numerous international laws and is something that the world should be concerned about. I mean, there are doctors who were in the middle of performing surgeries who were yanked out of the operating rooms and thrown in jail.
Oh my goodness. Wow. Is there a parallel between the official actions you documented in Bahrain and the means used by the Syrian government to repress its domestic opposition?
I'd say that, yeah. I mean, they're doing everything they can in Bahrain to try to demonize the protesters and get rid of the protests. I mean, they think that they can just have this go away. So that's why it's so important for us journalists to be covering the story so that we can comb through all of their PR tactics. They've spent millions of dollars hiring Western PR companies to try to drown out the voices of the protesters. And so really the greatest ally for these pro-democracy protesters is the media. They need the media to comb through all of this and really get down to the truth. And that the truth is that this regime, the majority of the people in Bahrain want this regime out. And the regime is doing everything it can right now to stay in power, and that's including using methods of torture and disappearing the opposition.
Now, what was the role that CNN played with you in sort of creating stories for the public?
Yeah, I went to Bahrain to do a documentary for CNN called iRevolution. A third of the documentary focused on Bahrain and how protesters were using social media to succeed in their revolution. And while we were there, we just witnessed all these horrific human rights abuses. And so when we got back to the U.S., we went on CNN to talk right away about everything that was happening in Bahrain. There was a point when we were reporting there that our crew was violently detained at machine gun point, and they tried to erase all of our video. So we were able to get out with this video and felt an extra important duty to get that video to the American public so they could see what this American-supported regime is doing. And so at first, I started airing stories on CNN, and it was I was on CNN US and CNN International with just daily news reports while we were editing our documentary. And at first, it was easy to get coverage on, but then the calls started coming in from the PR companies representing Bahrain, also the Bahrain regime itself. And that's when I started having an issue because I started noticing these PR statements and government propaganda being added to the end of my reports and actually into my reports. In all fairness, I felt that some of my editors were doing that to be more fair to the regime, but at the same time it was adding dangerous propaganda that undermined the cause of these pro-democracy protesters.
You are listening to Gary Franchi speaking with Amber Lyon right here on the Tony Styles Show. We've got to take a final break. We'll be right back after this quick message.
Karate and friendship